Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 560, The Otaku, Part 2. Last week, the focus of our episode was on the ways in which otaku culture, however you might define that term, doesn't actually represent this radical break with the past, but follows patterns from earlier periods of what you might call fandom. That's because, as I said last week, I do think it's revealing in many ways to think about otaku-ness, so to speak, as not some new phenomenon created by modern society, but as something people have always engaged in. Fandom, being a fan of something in a shared community built around the love of something you enjoy, people have been doing that for a long time. And we lose sight of something if we treat that reality and treat fan culture as something fundamentally new. But this week I want to focus on what is distinctive or unique about the otaku scene, so to speak, the ways in which it does represent something new in Japanese society. Because while fandom is nothing new, there are elements of what we call otaku culture that are distinctly modern, and to start talking about them, we must begin, of course, with some good old-fashioned historical context. Particularly, of course, we must focus on the context of the post-war era, because otaku culture in its modern sense really begins in the mid-70s, which was, well, let's call it a complex time in Japanese history. So, for a quick refresh, from a certain perspective, post-war Japanese history is all about the collapse of what had once been a sort of grand narrative of Japanese history, and the search for something to replace it. And what I mean by that is simply, if you were growing up in Japan before 1945, the answer to questions like, what does it mean to be Japanese? What is a person's role in the Japanese nation? What is Japan's collective goal as a nation? Those all would have been pretty straightforward to answer. Being Japanese meant loyalty to the emperor and a recognition of the distinct relationship between the emperor, the people, and the gods created by imperial propaganda. The role of subjects was to offer themselves up for the nation in defense of that relationship, and in the meantime to advance the empire through sacrifice and hard work. And the collective goals were, at least on paper, simple enough: security, prosperity, and the power to keep those other two things. But defeat, of course, collapsed that whole narrative of what it meant to be Japanese. That mindset clearly had led to nothing but war and disaster. So okay, if the old answers don't work anymore, what are the answers now? The next 25 years of Japanese history, again, at least from this perspective, were a battle between two competing groups, each claiming to have those answers. On the one hand was Japan's resurgent political left, whose claim was that Japan's identity going forward had to be grounded in the historic struggle for equality between classes and/or races. Many of the leading thinkers of the Japanese left were very heavily influenced by Marx, who didn't have a lot to say about race discrimination, and so the question of racial politics was always a bit muddled here. But broadly, the common vision for Japan was to be a sort of Switzerland of Asia that was neutral in the Cold War, focused on political pacifism and left-wing social and economic reform to create a more just society at home and abroad. Then you had the conservatives, embodied primarily in the form of the post-war Liberal Democratic Party, whose vision was more a modification than a rejection of ideas before 1945. Japan still had to be a strong nation and seek power and prestige on the world stage, but by means of economic power and a close relationship with the US. The goal of the Japanese people, according to the LDP, should be get rich. That wealth would get the country the respect it had always deserved. Japanese identity in this line of thinking was still something special and prized, but the role of the imperial throne in making it special was dialed back a bit, though never fully erased. Of course, both the debates within these groups and between these groups were much more complex than I'm making out here, but as a general summary, it gives you the idea. We've talked at great length in past episodes about the battles between these two groups in the 50s and 60s for the soul, so to speak, of post-war Japan. We're not going to go back over all of that here. Because the upshot of it all is that by the 1970s, broadly, the right wing was victorious. The major parties of the political left failed to gain traction. The socialists devolved into acrimonious political infighting over why they couldn't win elections, and the communists either moderated or, and this is true, got themselves arrested trying to do things like kidnap the prime minister using improvised grenades made from fertilizer and pachinko balls, or tried to flee the country for North Korea, and unfortunately for many of them, succeeded in doing so. The left-wing student movement, meanwhile, once one of the driving forces of the political left, split into its own multi-decade factional war that left dozens dead and the movement itself divided, paralyzed, and a shadow of its former self. However, even as the Conservative Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, proved victorious in this ideological struggle, its own grand narrative of Japan's future had started to falter. By 1970, Japan's economic rebirth was well underway. The LDP's dream, in a sense, of a prosperous post-war country had been achieved. Yet the LDP didn't really have a new vision to offer here. Just make more money proved increasingly less inspiring as a slogan for the future. And of course, at the same time, the LDP itself was increasingly beset by scandals, for which it was never really electorally punished because the dysfunction of the opposition parties and the nature of the voting system made it hard for the party to ever lose. The growing wealth of Japanese society, meanwhile, led to a flourishing consumerism. Already by the 70s, you see photos of the major cities littered with advertising and billboards and neon signs, all the hallmarks of modernity everywhere. Japan had become, functionally, a first world country. The motivating force for much of the population had in the span of 2 decades changed from scrape together enough to live, to be wealthier than you were, to just buy everything you want. Much academic ink has been spilled on the subject of this growing consumer culture in Japan. Probably the most famous work, at least in English, is Yoshikuni Igarashi's Japan 1972, which is all about the ways in which mass media, like movies, reflected this increasingly commercialized culture. It's a really fascinating subject and something I might return to in the future if folks show an interest, but the important thing for us is that in this new society, increasingly, people were defined less by what they did for a living or anything like that, and more by what they bought, by the brands they consumed and what those brands signified to others, which is, again, a feature of pretty much any consumer society. Now, I don't think any of this is going to revolutionize your worldview. The idea that we define ourselves around what we buy and signal to others who we are based on what we buy, how we dress, things like that, is the basis of pretty much all modern advertising. Watch any commercial in the United States and you'll see it at play. But what's interesting to consider is how otaku culture as we think of it today both grows out of this consumerist mindset and is a reaction against that consumerist mindset. How is that the case? Well, my friends, it's time, at long last, to talk about Comiket. Of course, sharp-eared listeners will note we already talked about Comiket, Nakamura Akio, the comedian and cultural critic, whose essays helped define the term otaku, noted sardonically the term didn't just refer to manga freaks and Comiket, so that phrasing would imply Comiket is pretty important to otaku identity, but it doesn't exactly tell us what it is. To understand that, we have to talk about a fascinating phenomenon first, dojinshi. Dojinshi are essentially amateur comics. The term comes from dojin, or literally same heart, referring to people who share some sort of common interest. More broadly, dojin has come to refer to fans and especially fan-created media. So dojinshi are, in essence, independently published works produced by, to use the Japanese term, sakuru, circles. In other words, groups of artists and writers who come together to collaborate on a project. That project is distributed and sold independently of commercial publishers. So in Japan, that would be serialized anthology publishers like Weekly Shonen Jump, or more traditional publishing houses like Kodansha or Hakusensha. Now, this is a type of what you might call independent publishing, or indie publishing, if we want to use a more informal English term, and that has a long history all its own, of course. What's interesting to note, however, is how quickly doujinshi start to emerge after the birth of the modern anime and manga industry. So, animation in Japan has, again, its own long and complex history, but what's important for our purposes is that after the Second World War, the influence of American animation studios, most especially, of course, the Walt Disney Corporation, helped shape a post-war animation industry in Japan that adapted Disney's techniques for quickly and affordably producing animated films. And in these developments, probably nobody is more important than one Tezuka Osamu, born in 1928 in the city of Osaka. Tezuka had been interested in manga, or Japanese comics, and animation from the time he was a young man, and more or less right after the Second World War he was able to start publishing some of his own comics. His real breakout, however, came in 1953 with probably the first big manga franchise in Japanese history, Tetsuan Atomu, or Mighty Atom, known in the US as Astro Boy. Now, we're not going to get too deep into the lore of Astro Boy, which, by the way, is the name I'm going to use going forward, simply because English-speaking listeners are more likely to know it. And really, for any of the franchises we talk about, my focus is mostly going to be on cultural impact and not so much on plots or characters or what have you. But for this franchise in particular, we do need to talk a little bit about why Astro Boy has the cultural cachet it does. So, it's about, well, the titular Astro Boy, who in Japanese is just called Atomu, or Atom, hence the Japanese series name Mighty Atom. Atom is a robot created as a sort of surrogate child by one Dr. Tenma. He appears very young, but has a whole host of classic robot upgrades, including jet boots, super strength, and of course the accessory any young boy needs, a literal machine gun that comes out of his hips. Much of the series is concerned with Atom/Astro Boy using his powers to fight various ne'er-do-wells, robot-hating humans, robots having gone amok, literal aliens, and in one notable entry, the actual US Air Force when he travels back in time to stop the US from bombing North Vietnam. As that last bit might clue you in on, it's a pretty political series. Tezuka, of course, grew up in a nation devastated by war, and was apparently very personally affected by hearing stories of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he wanted to create stories intended to inspire young people to optimism and doing the right thing. So he designed Atom as a character who is a sort of moral role model, given great power and taught to use it to create a better world where robots and humans can live together in peace. Atom is thus the prototype for basically every anime and manga protagonists for the rest of linear time, all of whom tend to be idealistic young people out to discover who they are and to learn how to use their robot powers or wizard magic or pocket monster friends or whatever to stop their own ne'er-do-wells while they learn the importance of being good and using the power they have responsibly. And this note of optimism really struck a chord, despite, or maybe because, of the fact the series was willing to tackle some pretty heavy stuff, as that reference to the Vietnam War might clue you in on. This in turn made Astro Boy enduringly popular. The manga ran from 1952 to 1968, and spawned in turn at least 4 animated series that I know of, and I was never that deep into it, so I might be missing a few. What matters for us is that the fandom that grew up around Astro Boy was such that, before long, fans began to produce their own fan works using Tezuka's characters. Often these fan works were put together by local fan clubs dedicated to Tezuka or to the Astro Boy franchise, and the works were so popular that in 1966 a publisher, Mushi Pro Corporation, started putting together a serial magazine to distribute them, this being how you had to do it in the pre-internet days. That magazine was called COM, C-O-M, and it held competitions to solicit the best Astro Boy-related fan works, as well as ads from local circles looking for members, especially artists and writers, who could help produce their own stuff. COM would only remain in circulation for 5 years before it closed up shop, but it proved momentous for bringing together some of the first larger-scale fan groups around a modern manga series, and from the jump, publication of fan-made dojinshi, their own fan comics, was a part of the whole formula. So even after COM closed up shop, fans found new ways to connect to each other by organizing some of the first fan conventions for anime fans. The first 2 major conventions were Manga Communication and Nihon Manga Taikai, or the Japan Manga Convention, both of which were fan-organized events involving lectures, manuscript exhibits, fan debates, secondhand book sales, discussion sessions, screenings of anime, meet and greets by artists, and even sleepovers for fans, as well as newsletters they produced when the face-to-face meetings were not happening. The model here was, of course, American comic conventions, which had started coming together for the first time around the mid-1960s. If you're wondering, San Diego Comic-Con, today the most popular of these conventions, first opens its own doors in 1970, right around the same time this is all happening in Japan. Nihon Manga Taikai in particular would blaze an important trail for fans going forward because it allowed fan circles to bring their dojinshi to conventions and sell them. However, these dojinshi sales were always a little bit looked down on. The general feeling among the organizers was that they were a nice afterthought, a good way to get more people in the door, but kind of fundamentally embarrassing when you really thought about it. As one fan who later went on to help organize Comiket would later recall, quote, "The organizers of Manga Taikai were elitist. The main events were always screenings and talks, so the dojin market was just one small room." Dojinshi producers took this rather personally and took their complaints to the Manga Taikai leadership, who were not very receptive to what they had to say. Things got to the point that the Manga Taikai organizers ended up barring Meikyu, one of the major associations of dojinshi circles, which had helped organize the dojin market at previous meetups, from attending future conventions. And so, Meikyu's leadership decided to set up their own convention, and thus was born Comiket, a contraction of Comic Market, Komikumaketo, that was a convention dedicated entirely to independently published work. The original Comiket, which opened its doors in 1975, was a pretty small affair with about 20 participating circles. So tiny, in fact, the organizers swiftly had to abandon their idea for creating a space only for dojinshi, and had to include talks and anime screenings as well, otherwise there just wouldn't have been enough to do. Those fillers, though, were eventually phased out, and today Comiket is entirely dojinshi driven. The marketplace is open twice a year, too, in winter and summer, it used to be just once, in one of Tokyo's largest convention centers. Comiket has become the symbol of dojinshi, this independently produced comic market that has become a substantial part of otaku culture as a whole. So much so, in fact, that a 2008 study found that a total of 27.73 billion yen had been spent on dojinshi in the previous year, about 15% of the total revenue of all businesses in otaku industries, so to speak. As a quick point of comparison, that would be around 230 million US dollars at the time, and for reference, the entire North American comic book market in 2007 was worth around $600 million. Now, there's one more thing I want to say about the dojin market before we trace the rise of another big phenomenon of otaku culture I want to talk about today. It's worth noting that in the 70s, a lot of the dojinshi produced by these circles were not, so to speak, derivative works. They were often independent ones. That was, in fact, what the founders of Comiket initially viewed as the point of the whole exercise, creating stuff that was maybe inspired by, say, Astro Boy, but still original and not just totally derivative. The first president of Comiket, Harada Teruo, actually said in an interview in 1979 that, quote, "I have no intention of repudiating fan clubs or cosplay, people who dress up as their favorite characters, but I had wanted to see circles creating original works flourish." But in that very same interview, Harada noted that Comiket's participating circles were mostly focused on stuff derived from famous franchises, and thus he said, quote, "My hopes for dojin to become a wellspring of new imaginings have shriveled." And that was back in 1979. Things have accelerated quite a bit since then. If you have any familiarity with the dojin market today, you know that most of the work you see is derivative in some way. And a survey of circles participating in Comiket in 2008 found that only 12.9% were focused on producing totally original work. The others were doing something that was derivative of either well-known franchises or major anthology serials like Weekly Shonen Jump. So what gives? Why has Comiket, or the dojin market more generally, come to be defined by what we might call derivative works? Well, there are a few reasons, but probably the most important is there's not really a firm divide between the independent and commercial comic scene in Japan. Most of Comiket's participating circles, in fact, include at least a few people who either actually work for commercial publishers or at least aspire to. That same survey I referenced found that only slightly over 30% of those participating in Comiket on the seller's side didn't aspire to work for a commercial magazine or publisher. It's pretty common, in fact, for artists and writers and their associated stories to start off as dojin and then be picked up by publishers if they do well. The dojin market serving, in essence, as a sort of laboratory experiment to determine what's popular with fans, with the best performing ideas then being rewarded with a commercial contract. The commercial presses have in fact found this so valuable, they sometimes sponsor their own dojin markets. Tokyo Bunge Publishing, for example, has sponsored several independent dojin markets since the 1990s. Many publishers have also signed on to a sort of dojin-friendly licensing system, allowing fan-made works to be sold for profit with some limits. So I don't think it'd be an understatement to say the dojin market has become commercialized pretty heavily, despite the initial vision of an independent scene. And more broadly, the commercialization of otaku culture is visible in one spot more than any other: Akihabara. Akihabara, if you are not familiar with it, is one of the neighborhoods of central Tokyo tucked away north of the center of the city. For most of the post-war period, it was a commercial district for electronics, the sort of place you might go, for example, as a young, recently married couple in the 60s or 70s, to pick up your own copies of the so-called three treasures that marked you as a well-to-do family: a dishwasher, a TV, and a refrigerator. Akihabara became Tokyo's electric town early in the post-war era. The neighborhood is still home to Tokyo Denki University, before 1949 known as Denki Gakko, a private school specializing in electrical engineering. And during the US occupation, many of the university's students, who were pretty hard off financially, as was everybody else, made money on the side building and fixing household radios, and as a result, other businesses specializing in electronics components began to congregate in the area. Of course, not all those businesses were strictly legal. Many were dealing in parts, for example, that had been illegally looted from old military supply dumps, and many didn't have any sort of permitting or even permanent spaces in which to operate. The result was a sprawling black market that, as black markets tend to do, brought a somewhat seedy element to the neighborhood. And so in 1949, US occupation authorities, cognizant of the issues created by the black market and wanting to engage in some urban renewal to widen the streets in that part of Tokyo, issued an ordinance banning the market. That ordinance, however, generated a lot of pushback from locals who were not super thrilled about losing their businesses, 1949 being a somewhat unstable moment in Japan's economic history. Eventually, the Tokyo metropolitan government stepped in to negotiate a solution. The area under the train tracks of the nearby train station in the Akihabara neighborhood wasn't being used at all. It could be the base of a new, legal, permitted electronics market. And from these humble beginnings emerged Akihabara's Electric Town, a marketplace for electronics and appliances that became this sort of showcase area for major national manufacturers. The stores that operated in this area were all pretty much along those lines. Akihabara's electronics markets, like say Ishimaru, were the Japanese equivalent of like a Best Buy or a Radio Shack, but a bit more prestigious, like the main showrooms for them. There were also some specialty stores too. Akihabara was actually a big audiophile district in the 70s, where young people would go to pick up high-quality home sound systems, but generally larger consumer appliances were what made the district tick. But then in the late 1980s, the ground began to shift. Larger chain shops like Yamada Denki, based in the suburbs and not as constrained by space as a shop in central Tokyo, and therefore able to showcase a broader array of offerings, began to eat away at the profits of Akihabara's electronic markets. And then, of course, came the economic downturn caused by the end of the bubble era. So Akihabara's businesses transitioned by focusing on a new market, selling personal computers, which by the 1990s were increasingly accessible to average consumers, particularly as the decade went on, with the ascent of Microsoft Windows as an operating system making computers easier for a non-expert to work with. This shift towards selling computers definitely worked. It got people back in the door, so to speak, and it created a noticeable shift in the demographics of who was shopping at Akihabara. No longer were families going as a unit to pick up their new fridge or dishwasher or whatever. Now it was mostly the kind of people who, in the 1990s, were into buying personal computers, which is to say mostly, though not entirely, young, single men. And it was this influx of new buyers which really transformed Akihabara, because by the late 1990s, a bunch of other shops were cropping up in the district, hoping to cater to this young male audience. Some of the first businesses to get on this new opportunity, a space they knew that their target market was likely to come to, and thus an ideal spot to set up shop, were businesses specialized in selling plastic models. Now, modeling has been a part of otaku culture pretty much from the jump. Train models were a part of the train otaku we talked about last week as far back as the 20s. By the 60s and 70s, model companies, mostly small ones run by and for fellow hobbyists, had started to shift towards models based on popular anime and manga, as well as some military modeling kits, tanks of various makes, fighter jets, that sort of thing. They tended to specialize in what are called garage kits, which, as the name gives away, originated in fan-made designs created in a home workshop that particularly skilled modelers then started producing for mass sale. By the 80s, models had grown enough as an industry that model makers could afford showrooms. Previously, they'd just been mail-order businesses, reliant on sales through ads and hobby magazines. Initially, they would set up shop wherever space was available. In the 1980s, in the greater Tokyo metro area, there were showrooms in Shibuya, Kichijoji, Shinjuku, and Yokohama. But by the 1990s, those businesses began to congregate in Akihabara, hoping to pick up business from the same young men who were going there to buy a PC. Probably the most prominent symbol of this transformation is one of Akihabara's most prominent buildings, the Radio Kaikan building, right next to the Electric Town exit from the neighborhood's Japan Rail station. Once upon a time, the Radio Kaikan building had been home to some of the biggest appliance and electronics retailers in the country, including, actually, the first shops to sell home computers in Japan. Supposedly, Masayoshi Son, the founder of Japan's famous SoftBank Corporation, and Nishi Kazuhiko, creator of one of Japan's oldest computer magazines, both frequented this area. However, as Akihabara's client base as a neighborhood began to shift, the shops in the Kaikan building started to turn over. In 2001, for example, a prestigious showroom owned by NEC, one of the biggest electronics retailers in the country, lost its lease to a garage model kit company. The Radio Kaikan building was just the start. Across the neighborhood, businesses selling video games, TVs, VCRs, videocassettes, and all that sort of thing proliferated. All businesses which had existed in Tokyo before the 1990s, but had once been scattered across the urban sprawl. Quite a few of these businesses catering to these young men also specialized in what we might call adult entertainments, which I'm not going to talk about too much here because a long time ago I marked this feed as clean, and I do not want to get dinged by the almighty podcast gods at Apple for violating that sacred bond, but let's just say that because of these businesses too, the things you will see in Akihabara have changed quite a bit since the days of it being a family-friendly electronics market. And so Akihabara became a sort of otaku metropolis, or at least a metropolis for a certain kind of otaku. Because that term has always had a gendered valence to it. I bet that when you hear it, you are picturing a nerdy-looking young man. Certainly that's the image the retailers of Akihabara held, presumably followed by a bunch of cartoon dollar signs, or I guess yen symbols, floating across their eyes. But the thing is that particularly in the 70s and 80s, Japanese otaku culture, Japanese nerddom you might call it, not only included a lot of female fans, but in many cases had been driven by their interests. Several of the founding members of Meikyu, that doujinshi collective that helped create Comiket, were women. The doujinshi boom of the 70s and 80s, driven by a growing interest in anime and manga, was fueled in part by what are called shonen manga, series aimed at young boys. These would be shows like Space Battleship Yamato, about a crew fighting aliens in a rebuilt and space-worthy Battleship Yamato, or Mobile Suit Gundam, which is also about fighting aliens, but this time in giant robots. But there were other series that drove this boom, including things like Rose of Versailles, about a cross-dressing woman living through the tumult of the French Revolution, and Captain Tsubasa, about a soccer team and its various trials and tribulations, and later in the 1990s, Sailor Moon. Interestingly, Captain Tsubasa in particular was marketed not as shoujo manga aimed at young girls, but as shonen manga aimed at young boys. However, from what we can tell, most of its fanbase in the 80s was made up of women. It is, in that way, a fascinating example about how some of these terms refer more to plot tropes and a narrative structure, as well as broad, very essentialized assumptions about what sorts of stories men and women enjoy, than actual popularity. Anyway, to the extent that Tokyo had an otaku district before Akihabara, the closest fit would be the eastern part of Ikebukuro on the northern part of the city center. Ikebukuro was home to a great many manga shops, many of which sold doujinshi produced by local circles. A few of those stores even specialized in catering to female fans. However, once the shift towards Akihabara started in the 1990s, many of the businesses of East Ikebukuro began to shift inventory they assumed male fans were interested in towards businesses in that neighborhood, and as a result, Ikebukuro became, in essence, the bastion of the female otaku culture that was left behind. Its most famous stretch today is called Otome Road, otome being an old-timey word meaning young girl that has also come to reference media aimed at young women. Otome Road is home to a whole stretch of bookstores and other businesses catering to the female half of the otaku fanbase, a very physical reflection of the gendered split of Japanese nerd culture. And yet it's Akihabara that has the claim to fame. It's both better known and, in my experience, advertises its own nature far more openly. Put another way, if you go to JR Akihabara Station, you will probably not even make it out of the station before you start seeing ads for anime or manga or games or things like that. It will be very clear to you where you are. JR Ikebukuro Station does not wear its nature on its sleeves in quite the same way. Now, you might remember when I started this episode off, I said that I was talking about how otaku culture in Japan represents both a reaction against consumerism and a reflection of it. I think you see that pretty clearly in the history here. For many young people burned out on the national search for wealth during the 70s and searching for something to connect to, engaging with pop culture was a way to escape a sense of aimlessness or lack of purpose. And that's not really anything new, to be fair. People have been looking for hobbies to find some joy and meaning in life for a long time, particularly as standards of living have gone up, making day-to-day survival less of an issue. But that very interest has also driven a new round of commercialization that makes a lot of otaku culture today just one more avenue to make money. And I think Comiket and Akihabara show that very clearly. Comiket in particular was intended to be this artsy indie showcase for doujinshi comics that represented a break from the mainstream, and now it is dominated by people looking to break into the mainstream, often using characters or ideas lifted from the mainstream. Akihabara, meanwhile, has become a very visible symbol of otaku culture in a physical space. It's probably the most prominent physical location of nerd culture in Japan, and the whole place is just designed to pander to the most stereotypical image of the male Japanese nerd in order to part them from their money. This is, of course, not a uniquely Japanese phenomenon. Just to give a personal example, I grew up in the 90s watching the X-Men cartoon back when Marvel was the province of the dorkiest people I knew, and now our cultural relationship to comic book stories in the US is pretty different. More broadly, of course, the tension between art as a commercial venture and art as this vehicle for self-expression is about as old as art is as a concept. Ultimately, the transformation of Japan's otaku culture is, for me, most interesting in that respect. It represents a transformation in the wider social narratives of Japanese history. As the boom days of the postwar have receded, followed first by the bubble era and then by the seemingly endless recession and stagnation, The social search for purpose and belonging, for something to strive to, for a group to be a part of, has fragmented too. Otaku culture represents one answer to that need, but like everything else in our world, it remains caught up in the gravity of commercialism, and now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go watch X-Men First Class for like the 20th time. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backwards podcast network. You can find more about our show at facingbackward.com, and you can donate there to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 3.